I am 76 years old, a widower of almost a decade, and I have learned to accept the quiet weight of solitude as though it were another piece of furniture in my home, something that has settled in with the years and become too heavy to move. Even if I wished to, my wife, Margaret, and I built this house brick by brick when we were still young and hopeful, saving every dollar from my work as a machinist and her job as a school secretary. The beams, the foundation, even the garden out back with its stubborn rose bushes all carry her presence. When she died, the house became my cathedral, a space where I could still feel her voice echoing in the walls, a place where I held on to the dignity of being the head of a family, even when life tried to convince me that my season of importance had passed. For years I lived here alone, preparing my own meals with a slow precision, reading the newspaper at the kitchen table at dawn, watching the neighborhood change through the front window. And in those quiet hours, I thought often about how Margaret would scold me for leaving my shoes in the hallway, or remind me to close the upstairs window when rain clouds gathered, and I would smile to myself, believing that those memories were enough to keep me anchored. Then, almost 3 years ago, my daughter Clara came to me with her husband Daniel and their 2 children, and they asked if they could move in for just a short while, because their own house was being renovated after what Daniel described as a catastrophic plumbing disaster. I remember the night vividly because Clara spoke with the kind of urgency she used as a teenager when she wanted to borrow the car, as if the request had already been granted and she only needed to soften the blow. I, being eager to feel the sound of a family in the house again, agreed without hesitation, thinking it would be a chance to have my grandchildren under my roof, to hear laughter echo through the hallways, to fill the spaces that had grown too silent. I imagined Saturday breakfasts where Clara would sit across from me like she had as a little girl, and I would slip a few extra dollars into the children's pockets when Daniel wasn't looking, just as I used to do with Clara when Margaret insisted we had to be strict. For a brief moment it felt as though the old dream of family had returned. At first the arrangement seemed almost pleasant. They occupied the upstairs bedrooms while I kept my space downstairs, and the kitchen smelled of fresh coffee again in the mornings, not just my single mug brewing, but several cups clattering and the sound of toast popping up from the old machine. The children, just teenagers now, filled the living room with the glow of their devices and the sound of their arguments, and though I did not always understand their jokes, I appreciated the energy. I told myself Margaret would have been glad to see the house alive again, glad that the place we built had not gone to waste. I allowed myself to believe that I was once more at the center of a living family, that the years of silence were finally at an end. But families are strange organisms, and what seems like life at first can curdle into something different before you realize it. Gradually, the house that was mine began to feel less and less like my own. Daniel took charge of repairs, often without asking, and he replaced the curtains Margaret had sewn with something modern and colorless. Clara spoke about how cluttered the old furniture looked, and one day I found that Margaret's favorite armchair, the one where she had nursed Clara as a baby, had been pushed into the garage beneath a tarp. My protest was brushed aside with laughter. "Dad, it's just furniture. Don't be sentimental." The words stung because they did not understand, or perhaps they did not care, that the chair was not merely wood and fabric, but a vessel of memory. Slowly, the house began to carry their choices, their sounds, their dominance, and my presence shrank to smaller and smaller corners. I told myself I was only being sensitive, that sharing space always required compromise, yet I could not ignore the growing unease. Evenings changed too. Where once I had eaten quietly at the kitchen table with a book propped open beside my plate, now dinner was a noisy affair with the television blaring, Daniel explaining his work troubles, Clara scrolling on her phone between bites, the grandchildren giggling at things I could not follow. When I tried to contribute to conversation, it was often brushed aside with indulgent smiles, the kind people give an old man whose words no longer carry weight. And though I told myself that being ignored was better than being completely alone, the truth is that loneliness within a crowd cuts deeper than solitude and silence. I could feel the dignity I had tried to preserve after Margaret's death slipping from me, piece by piece, as though I were being erased within my own walls. The first real wound came not from malice, but from thoughtlessness. One night they held a party for Daniel's colleagues, and the house filled with strangers. When I asked where I might rest, Clara casually suggested I could take a blanket and lie down in the den because the bedrooms were already spoken for. I remember standing there, stunned, realizing that my own bed, the one I had slept in for 40 years, was now treated as a guest room. That night I did what she said. I lay down on the floor of the den with a blanket barely covering me, listening to the muffled laughter and clinking glasses upstairs. In the morning, when the party had dwindled and the guests were gone, I woke stiff and aching, only to hear my grandchildren giggling that Grandpa looked like a homeless man sprawled on the carpet. Clara laughed too, and though perhaps she thought it harmless, the sound burned into me. At that moment I felt the deep humiliation of being a stranger in my own home. Yet still, I kept silent. Pride can be a stubborn companion, and I told myself that it was better to endure quietly than to cause a scene that might fracture what remained of family life. I had grown up in a generation that prized stoicism, that taught men to endure hardship without complaint, and perhaps I mistook endurance for wisdom. But with each passing week, the signs became harder to ignore. Daniel began speaking casually about how elderly people really should think about assisted living, his words delivered with a joking tone but eyes that betrayed seriousness. Clara began to ask if I had considered what would happen when you can't manage the stairs anymore, though she knew I rarely went upstairs at all. And the grandchildren, picking up the cues, treated me as an object of ridicule rather than respect, mocking the way I dozed in my chair or forgot the names of their online games. The house, my house, had become an arena where my dignity was chipped away under the cover of family banter. Inside I felt a mixture of sorrow and anger, but above all, a heavy confusion. How had it come to this? I had given everything to Clara, sacrificed nights and weekends working overtime to put her through college, watched proudly as she built her own life, only to find myself diminished when she returned. I could not decide if the cruelty I felt was intentional or simply the blind selfishness of a younger generation that believes the world has already passed the old by. Sometimes, late at night, I walked the darkened hallways, running my hand along the walls, whispering to Margaret as though she were still here, asking her if we had raised Clara wrong, if we had made her too practical, too ungrateful. The silence gave no answers, only deepened the ache in my chest. And yet, even in that ache, I held on to one truth that kept me steady. The house was still legally mine. The deed bore my name alone. The taxes were paid from my account, and though they filled the rooms with their presence, I was the one who had built and owned it. That fact, unspoken and invisible, was like a small ember I held in my hand. I never flaunted it, never threatened with it, but I knew it was there. In the beginning, I thought it simply gave me comfort, a reminder that no matter how invisible they made me feel, I had not been entirely erased. But as the humiliations grew, as the laughter at my expense echoed louder, that ember began to glow with a different heat, one I did not yet fully recognize, but which would, in time, change everything. The moment that changed everything came not with violence or cruelty shouted in anger, but with the kind of careless laughter that cuts far deeper than words meant to wound, because it revealed how little they thought of me, how easily I had been reduced in their eyes to a caricature of age rather than the man who had once built the walls around them. It happened on a weekend evening when Clara decided to host another gathering, this time not of Daniel's colleagues, but of her friends from the community, women she had grown up with who now lived in the same town and gathered occasionally to compare. Children, jobs, and husbands. The house bustled with activity, and I retreated, as I always did, moving quietly around the edges, not wanting to intrude, though each step I took across the floors I had paid for made me ache with the irony of feeling like an unwelcome guest. As the evening dragged on, I looked for a place to rest, for my knees had begun to ache, and I dared to suggest I might take the spare room upstairs. Clara's response was immediate, delivered with a tone that was casual enough to disguise its sting. "Oh, Dad, the kids are already in there with their friends. You can make yourself comfortable on the couch in the den." It was the same den where the television blared all hours, where the children left their shoes and bags scattered, a space that had never belonged to me. I took a blanket from the hall closet and spread it on the floor, because even the couch was piled with coats from the guests, and as I lowered myself carefully onto the carpet, feeling my bones complain, I told myself this was only for a night, that perhaps it was foolish pride to expect a bed when there were so many visitors. But as I lay there in the dark, the sound of laughter drifting down from the upstairs rooms, I felt an overwhelming loneliness press against me, a sharp reminder that in my own house I was no longer considered the host, not even considered a member of the gathering, but an afterthought, a relic tucked away out of sight. Sleep did not come easily, and when it finally did, it was restless, filled with the kind of shallow dreams where Margaret's voice tried to reach me but dissolved into the sound of strangers talking above my head. At dawn I stirred, my back stiff from the hard floor, the blanket twisted around me, and before I could rise fully, I heard voices at the door of the den. My grandchildren stood there with two of their friends, their faces bright with the mischief of youth, whispering too loudly, thinking I was asleep. One of them pointed and snickered, "Look at Grandpa, like a homeless man camping on the floor." Another chimed in, "Should we put a cup next to him so people can throw coins?" The laughter that followed was light and careless, but it pierced me to the core, because I realized they did not see me as a figure of respect or even of pity, but as an object of ridicule, a figure to be mocked for amusement. I opened my eyes, and the sight of their smirking faces branded itself into me. Clara appeared moments later, drawn by the noise, and instead of rebuking them, she laughed as well, saying, "Don't tease him too much, kids. He's just trying to get comfortable." Her words were meant, perhaps, to soften the cruelty, but instead they confirmed that in her eyes, too, my dignity was expendable. I rose slowly, every joint aching, and I wanted to shout, to demand respect, to remind them that I had built this roof, that every board and nail was mine long before they returned, but the words caught in my throat. I went instead to the kitchen, boiled water for coffee, and sat alone at the table while the voices behind me still carried their laughter. That morning, as I sipped the bitter cup, I realized that something inside me had shifted. Until then I had endured their slights with patience, telling myself it was better to have them close, to accept humiliation in exchange for the illusion of family. But humiliation has a way of fermenting, and that morning it changed flavor, turning from sorrow into resolve. Later that day, Clara came into the kitchen, distracted by her phone, and without looking up she said, "Dad, you really should think about assisted living one of these days. You'd have more company your own age, and it would free up space here." She said it so casually, as though she were suggesting I change a brand of cereal, not as though she were proposing to exile me from the house where my entire life's labor and memory lay. I stared at her, but she did not meet my eyes. She tapped on her screen, smiled faintly at something a friend had written, and then added, "Besides, you don't look very comfortable here anymore, do you?" That was the moment the ember I had been carrying, the knowledge that the deed still bore my name, began to glow with heat. They thought me already diminished, already displaced, but in truth, I still held the power of ownership. The final spark came that evening when Daniel returned from work and, over dinner, mentioned that he had spoken with a neighbor about future plans for the property. He said it in a way that included Clara but excluded me, as though the house were already theirs. "When we redo the kitchen, we'll finally get rid of that old wallpaper your dad likes," he said with a grin, and Clara nodded as though discussing a certainty. Then, as if to drive the point further, he added, "Eventually, maybe next year, we'll think about an addition out back, but we'll need to handle the paperwork to make sure everything's clear." His words carried an assumption that my place in these decisions was non-existent. I set my fork down and asked quietly, "What paperwork?" Daniel looked at me with a polite smile, the kind one offers a child. "Don't worry about it, Dad. Clara and I have it under control. Just enjoy your retirement." I did not respond, but inside me something hardened. For years I had given, provided, endured. I had accepted their indifference, their subtle cruelties, because I believed that love required sacrifice and that family bonds demanded patience. But that day, after sleeping on the floor of my own house and hearing laughter at my expense, after being spoken to as though I were already irrelevant. I understood that patience had been mistaken for weakness. They did not respect me because I had not required respect. They did not see me as the master of this house because I had allowed myself to shrink into the corners. That night, lying in my bed at last, staring at the ceiling Margaret had painted long ago, I whispered to her memory that I could not let this continue. If they saw me as nothing more than an old man to be shuffled aside, then I would remind them, quietly, decisively, that the ground beneath their feet was still mine to give or to take away. In the days that followed the humiliation of that night on the floor, the atmosphere in the house did not soften, but grew heavier, as though my quiet withdrawal had given them permission to advance further into territories of disrespect that they had only tiptoed around before. Clara began to speak more openly about what to do with Dad, her words floating through the kitchen while she chopped vegetables or loaded the dishwasher, not directed at me, but not hidden either, as though she assumed I was already half-deaf or too diminished to care. "Assisted living communities have great amenities now," she told Daniel one evening while I sat only a few feet away, sipping my tea. "They have gyms and libraries, and people his age. He'd probably be happier there." Daniel, without looking in my direction, replied that it would also make the house less crowded, and he laughed as though it were a harmless joke. The laughter cut me in a way sharper than anger could have because it reduced my presence, my entire being, to the problem of clutter, no different than a piece of worn furniture taking up space. At meals, the dismissals continued in smaller but more persistent forms, the kind that wear down the spirit not by force, but by erosion. If I asked for the salt, one of the children would hand it to me with exaggerated slowness, smirking at the way my hands trembled slightly. When I tried to join their conversations, Clara would glance at her phone and nod absently, or Daniel would interrupt with a change of subject, steering the dialogue back to his work projects. Even the grandchildren, once sweet and affectionate when they were younger, now rolled their eyes when I repeated a story, whispering to each other, "He already told that." I began to eat faster, speaking less, and eventually taking my meals in the corner of the kitchen rather than at the table, convincing myself it was easier that way. But inside I could feel the weight of indignity piling higher, layer upon layer, as though each remark and dismissal was another brick sealing me off from the family that once had been mine. The erosion extended beyond words. One afternoon I went to the closet to retrieve my coat, the heavy wool one Margaret had bought me for our anniversary decades ago, only to find it missing. After some searching, I discovered it folded in a donation box by the garage door, mixed with old clothes Clara had decided to give away. When I confronted her, pointing out that the coat was mine and that I still wore it every winter, she shrugged and said, "Dad, it's so outdated. You'll look better with something new. Don't be stubborn." The way she said it, as though she were correcting a child's tantrum, made me realize that in her eyes I no longer had the authority to decide even what clothes I wore. Later, I found that several of Margaret's keepsakes, small figurines and framed photographs, had been boxed up as well, shoved into the attic because, as Clara explained, they make the place look old-fashioned. It was not just me they were erasing. From the house, it was Margaret too, as though her memory could be tidied away to create room for a future in which I had no role. The final insult during those weeks came on a Sunday evening when Clara invited neighbors over for dinner. I had spent the afternoon quietly in my room, listening to the clatter of pans and the rising murmur of voices downstairs, but eventually I emerged, thinking I might sit with them, if only to hear the conversation and share a meal. When I entered the dining room, however, there was no chair set for me at the table. Every seat was occupied, and Daniel, noticing me hovering awkwardly in the doorway, laughed and said, "Oh, Dad, you can grab a plate and eat in the living room. It'll be more comfortable for you." The words carried a kind of forced cheer, but I saw the guests glance at one another, embarrassed, and I knew they understood the truth that I was not part of the family gathering, but an appendage to be managed, a shadow shuffled aside. I took my plate and retreated, eating alone in the living room, while the sounds of laughter drifted through the doorway, the same sounds that had once filled my house when Margaret and I hosted friends. But now they mocked me with their exclusion. Each of these moments might have been survivable on its own. After all, an old man can learn to endure slights when he tells himself they are born of carelessness rather than malice. but together they began to form a pattern too clear to ignore. It was not merely that I was being pushed aside in my own home, it was that they had already begun to imagine a future without me, and they were preparing the ground for that future step by step, joke by joke, dismissal by dismissal. My role was no longer that of father or grandfather, but of obstacle, something to be managed until it could be removed. The more I thought about it, the more I realized that their laughter, their condescension, their casual discussions about assisted living were not random cruelties, but early stages of eviction, an eviction masked by the language of care, but driven by convenience and greed. One evening, unable to sleep, I went down to the basement where I kept old files and documents. There, in a worn metal cabinet, I found the deed to the house, the yellowed paper still bearing my name alone, signed in ink that had faded but not disappeared. I ran my fingers across the signature, remembering the day Margaret and I had signed it, proud of what we had built, dreaming that this house would be our legacy. For years I had thought of it as a document of memory, a relic, but that night I saw it differently. It was not only a relic, but a weapon, the last proof that I still had authority, that I still had power they did not suspect. While upstairs, Clara and Daniel laughed about weekend plans. I stood in the dim basement light with the deed in my hands, and for the first time in years I felt the stirrings of something more than endurance. I felt the possibility of action. Yet I did not act immediately, for action requires more than anger. It requires the resolve to face what will follow. Instead, I returned the deed to its folder, locked the cabinet, and carried the knowledge in my heart like a secret flame. Over the next weeks, I observed them more carefully, noting how easily they assumed I was blind to their intentions. Clara spoke about remodeling their house. Daniel bragged about its value to friends. The children boasted about their rooms as though I were already gone. I smiled faintly at their arrogance, though inside me I felt the flame growing stronger. I knew they would never expect what I was beginning to consider, and when the moment came, I promised myself. It would not be with shouting or confrontation, but with the quiet certainty of a man reclaiming what was his. The true turning point arrived in the most unexpected of ways, not with confrontation or raised voices, but through a casual oversight that revealed to me how completely they had underestimated both my memory and my capacity to understand what was happening around me. It was a quiet afternoon when Clara had gone out shopping with the children, and Daniel, believing himself alone in the house, sat in the dining room with his laptop open, speaking on the phone in a tone of confidence that he never used when I was present. I was in the hallway, moving slowly because of the stiffness in my knees, and I heard his voice carrying through the open doorway. He was discussing mortgage options with someone, perhaps a broker or an agent, and he said clearly, "Yes, we'll have to get my father-in-law's name off the title eventually. But it shouldn't be hard. He doesn't really know what he signed, and Clara can talk him into it when the time comes." The words hit me with the force of a physical blow, and I stood frozen in the hall, gripping the banister as though to steady myself. In that instant, every doubt I had carried about whether their neglect was careless or deliberate dissolved, and the truth became sharp and undeniable. They did not merely see me as irrelevant. They saw me as an obstacle to be maneuvered around, a man too feeble to understand legal documents, someone who could be coaxed into surrendering his rights with a signature. They had already begun to plan for the house as though it were theirs, and the only thing standing in their way was the inconvenient fact of my name on a deed. I withdrew quietly before Daniel could notice me, but the sound of his confident voice replayed in my head all evening, hardening the flame that had already begun to burn in me into something more dangerous. That night, I could not sleep. I sat in the darkened living room, staring at the shadows of the furniture that no longer belonged to me in spirit, though it was still mine in law, and I thought of Margaret. She had trusted me to protect what we built, to carry forward the memory of our labor, and here I was, mocked by children and spoken of as though I were incompetent. I realized then that to continue enduring would not be patience but betrayal. Betrayal of her memory, of the years we had sacrificed, of the dignity that she had once said was the most important possession a man could keep. Slowly, as dawn began to color the sky beyond the curtains, I made a silent vow to her memory. I would not allow myself to be erased. I would not permit them to inherit the fruits of our labor through deceit and disrespect. And if they insisted on treating me as though I were already gone, then I would show them what it meant to underestimate the living. In the following days, I tested my suspicions carefully. I asked Clara, in a tone as casual as I could manage, about the paperwork for the house, pretending confusion, feigning forgetfulness, and her reaction confirmed everything. She smiled gently, the way one does with a child, and said, "Don't worry about those things, Dad. Daniel and I will take care of it when the time comes. You just need to sign where we tell you. It's all routine." Her words were meant to soothe, but they burned like acid because they revealed the plan in its entirety. They assumed I was too weak, too tired, too desperate for their approval to resist, that I would sign away my rights without question. I nodded and thanked her, all the while hiding the storm inside me, and in that moment the ember I had carried became a full flame, no longer the comfort of secret knowledge, but the energy of determination. The next morning, while they were out, I retrieved the deed again from the basement cabinet. I laid it on the kitchen table in the bright light of day and read it line by line, every clause, every stipulation, until the words etched themselves into my mind. There it was, in unambiguous language. The property was mine, solely and fully. There was no co-owner, no joint agreement, no loophole they could exploit without my consent. All their assumptions, all their whispered plans, all their laughter at my expense had been built on a foundation of ignorance. The house was mine, and I could do with it what I wished. That realization, clear and cold, changed everything. But knowledge is not power until it is acted upon. And as I stared at the document, I realized that the time for endurance had ended. I could not confront them directly because confrontation would only give them a chance to twist my words into weakness, to cast me as senile or unstable. No, the answer would have to come quietly, decisively, with the certainty of law on my side and with the element of surprise they had long since forgotten I was capable of. In that moment a plan began to form, fragile but intoxicating. I would not merely defend what was mine, I would take from them the very thing they coveted, the roof over their heads, the symbol of security they assumed was already theirs. The shift inside me was subtle, but irreversible. When Clara made her little jokes about nursing homes, I smiled faintly, and when Daniel spoke to neighbors about their house, I nodded as though in agreement. I no longer felt anger at their words, only a kind of grim amusement, because I knew what they did not, that the ground beneath their feet could be pulled away at any moment, and the power to do so rested quietly in my hands. I began to visit a lawyer discreetly, gathering information, learning what steps would be required should I decide to sell. Each visit, each quiet conversation strengthened my resolve until one evening, as I stood again in the empty den where they had once laughed at me for sleeping on the floor, I whispered to myself the truth I had come to accept. The days of humiliation were over, and the balance would soon be reversed. If the humiliation of the floor and the whispers of removing my name from the deed had lit the fuse, the following weeks were the explosion, for in that time their disdain for me sharpened into open hostility, not violent or shouted, but in the cold certainty of people who had stopped pretending to care. I could feel it in the way Clara spoke to me as though I were already halfway gone. Her voice dipped in condescension, and in the way Daniel began to speak of finances as though my presence were merely a line item on a budget that needed to be eliminated. Their impatience grew, and so did my silence. But while they believed my silence meant surrender, in truth, it was the mask behind which I was building my answer. The first clear signal came on a Sunday morning when Clara entered my room without knocking, her arms full of laundry that she dumped unceremoniously on the chair by the window. "Dad," she said, not meeting my eyes, "Daniel and I have been talking. We really think it's time you start looking at assisted living. You'll be more comfortable there. They'll cook for you, help with your medications, and you won't have to deal with stairs anymore. We've already scheduled a tour for next week." The way she said it, already scheduled, told me all I needed to know. In her mind, the decision had already been made, and I was to simply nod and follow along like a child being told which school he would attend. I asked her quietly, "And what about the house?" She gave me a smile that was all surface and no warmth. "Don't worry about that, Dad. We'll take care of everything. You just need to think about yourself." Her words churned in me for days, not because I feared the prospect of a nursing home, but because I understood the truth behind them. They wanted me gone so they could claim what they thought was theirs. It was not concern for my well-being, but hunger for possession that drove them. The proof came a week later when I overheard Daniel on the phone again, his voice sharp with irritation as he said, "We can't keep waiting, Clara." He's dragging his feet. "The market's good now, and we need to move before interest rates climb. If he won't sign willingly, we'll have to push him harder. Play the memory card, make him doubt himself. He's already slipping." Hearing those words, spoken about me as though I were a burden to be manipulated, solidified what I already knew. They were not just negligent children. They were predators, circling what they thought was weak prey. The manipulation began subtly at first. Clara would remind me of events that had not happened, saying things like, "Dad, don't you remember spilling soup on yourself last week? That's why I told you to be careful with the stove, even though I knew no such incident had occurred." Daniel would smirk and say, "You already told that story yesterday, when I mentioned a memory, though I was certain I had not." These little gaslighting tricks were meant to make me doubt my own mind, to create a record of confusion that they could later use to declare me unfit. I saw through it, but I played along, nodding occasionally, letting them think their performance was working. If they believed I was drifting into forgetfulness, all the better for me when the reversal came. The grandchildren, whether knowingly or simply imitating their parents, joined in the erosion. One evening, when I was slow to rise from my chair, one of them quipped, "Careful, Grandpa, don't break a hip." And Daniel laughed louder than anyone, adding, "Well, at least then we'd have a reason to get you into proper care." The cruelty was not hidden anymore. It was displayed openly, a sport in which I was the unwilling participant. I said nothing, but inside me the plan grew sharper, and each remark was fuel. It was around this time that I began my visits to the lawyer in earnest. I told them I was going for walks to keep my joints moving, and they dismissed me with absent nods, assuming I was too frail to go far. In truth, I was meeting with a man who laid out for me in clear, precise terms the steps necessary to sell the house, to transfer ownership, to do so legally without their consent. Each time I left his office, papers folded neatly in my jacket, I felt as though Margaret herself walked beside me, her hand on my arm, her voice telling me I was doing what had to be done. For the first time in years, I felt not only like a father, not only like a man, but like the guardian of my own dignity, and that sensation was intoxicating. When I returned home, their treatment of me only intensified. Clara would complain to friends on the phone within earshot that she was doing everything for her aging father and that it was exhausting to manage an old man who forgets things. Daniel began locking his office when he left the house, as though he feared I might stumble upon something I should not see. I already knew enough. I had heard the whispers, read the documents, and seen the smug certainty in their eyes. They were waiting for me to falter, to surrender, to give them the victory they assumed was inevitable. But in their waiting, they left me time to prepare, and every cruel word they spoke only made my resolve more ironclad. The second escalation came to a head one evening when Daniel confronted me directly. I had been sitting in the living room, reading quietly, when he entered with a folder in his hand. He placed it on the table in front of me and said, "Dad, these are just some routine papers. If you sign them, it'll make things easier for everyone. Clara and I will handle the bills, the taxes, everything. You won't have to worry about a thing." I opened the folder and scanned the top page, and though I did not understand every line of legal jargon, I saw enough to know what it was, a transfer of ownership cloaked in neutral language. I looked up at him and asked, "And what happens if I don't sign?" His smile tightened, the mask slipping just enough for me to glimpse the irritation beneath. "Then you make things harder than they need to be. Look, we're just trying to help you. But this is the smart move. You'll thank us later." I closed the folder gently and slid it back across the table. "Not today," I said softly. Daniel's jaw tightened, and for a moment I thought he might snap, but then he forced a laugh and said, "Suit yourself, and we'll try again later." When he left the room, I opened my book again, but I could not read a single word. My hands were trembling, not from fear, but from the raw energy of knowing that the battle lines were now fully drawn. There would be no going back to quiet endurance, no pretending that their intentions were anything but selfish. They wanted the house, and they wanted it soon. What they did not know was that I had already taken the first steps to strip it from them before they could touch it. I had already spoken with the lawyer about potential buyers, already learned how quickly a sale could be arranged. Their plan to pressure me into signing my rights away was collapsing before it had even begun, and I watched them grow bolder, more reckless, more cruel, even as the ground beneath them was already slipping. The last and perhaps most painful blow of that period came from Clara herself. One night as she was leaving the kitchen, she turned back and said with a sigh, "Dad, sometimes I think you don't even realize how hard it is for us. You sit there like everything's fine, but do you know what it's like to take care of someone who doesn't even appreciate it? We've put our lives on hold for you. Don't you think it's time you gave something back?" The words twisted in my chest because in her mouth the story had become one where she and Daniel were the martyrs, burdened by an ungrateful old man, rather than what it truly was, a daughter, betraying her father for the promise of inheritance. I wanted to shout that I had already given, that every hour of overtime, every dollar saved, every nail hammered into the walls of this house had been for her, that my entire life had been a gift she now dismissed as nothing. But I said nothing. I only nodded because in silence I was already planning the final turn. And so the second escalation reached its height. They had shown their motives clearly. They had pressed me to surrender. They had mocked me openly, and all the while they thought I was too weak to resist. In their certainty, they had given me the perfect opportunity. They believed I was fading, but in truth, I was gathering strength. And when the time came, the blow would fall not with anger, but with the cold precision of justice. The moment of reckoning did not arrive with thunder or confrontation in the middle of a heated quarrel, as one might imagine such reversals usually do, but in the stillness of an ordinary afternoon, when the weight of all their schemes and my silent preparation finally converged into one decisive act. For months I had endured their barbed words, their little manipulations, their smug certainty that I was slipping into confusion and dependence, and in that time I had moved quietly behind the curtain, arranging the steps they never imagined I was capable of taking. The lawyer had already found a buyer eager to take the property quickly. The papers had been drawn, and all that remained was my signature, my single, deliberate stroke of a pen that would alter the balance of our lives. When I walked into his office that day, my cane clicking against the floor, my hands trembling only from age and not hesitation, I felt a calmness settle over me, the kind of calm one feels before a storm breaks, knowing it cannot be stopped. I signed slowly, deliberately, watching my name etch across the page, and when I placed the pen down, the deed was no longer mine, but belonged to strangers, and with it the roof over Clara and Daniel's heads was gone. Leaving the office, I did not rush. I walked slowly through the streets of town, breathing deeply of the autumn air, letting the enormity of what I had done sink into me. For decades I had been the provider, the protector, the man who sacrificed quietly so his family might thrive, and for years after Margaret's death I had been the relic they tolerated, a figure to be managed, mocked, or dismissed. But in that one act I had seized back the power they thought had withered in me, and though they would not know it until the letter from the lawyer arrived, their world had already shifted beneath them. I almost smiled at the thought of their faces when they opened the notice, expecting perhaps another document for me to sign away my rights, and instead finding the stark reality that I had sold the house entirely without their consent. The silence of my revenge was sweeter than any shouted rebuke could have been. The explosion came 3 days later. I was in the small park near the lawyer's office, feeding the pigeons, when Clara's car screeched to a halt on the curb, and she leapt out, her face pale with shock and streaked with tears. Daniel followed, his expression red with fury, and they descended upon me as though I were a criminal who had stolen something precious, when in truth I had only reclaimed what was mine. Clara's voice shook as she cried, "Dad, what have you done? The house, our house, it's sold. Do you realize what you've done to us?" Daniel's voice thundered over hers. "You had no right. We built our life there, we put our money into it, and you've destroyed everything." I looked at them calmly, still holding the paper bag of breadcrumbs in my hand, and answered softly, "I had every right. It was my house. You laughed while I slept on the floor of my own home. You spoke of me as though I were already gone. You plotted to take it from me as if I were too blind to notice. You forgot that the roof you lived under was mine to give and mine to take. Now it belongs to someone else." The words struck them harder than shouting could have. Clara's knees seemed to buckle, and she sat heavily on the park bench beside me, sobbing into her hands. Daniel paced like a caged animal, his fists clenching and unclenching, his fury barely contained. "You've ruined us," he spat, his voice trembling. "Where are we supposed to go? What about the kids? Do you know what you've done to your own grandchildren?" I turned my gaze on him, steady and unflinching. "My grandchildren laughed when they saw me lying on the floor. My daughter told me to prepare for a nursing home while she plotted to erase my name. You all showed me what I meant to you. If you believed family was measured only in property, then let this be your lesson. Property can be taken away." Clara looked up then, her face twisted with a mixture of grief and rage. "We're your family. How could you do this to us?" Her words cracked like glass under strain, and for a moment I almost pitied her. But then I remembered the night she had laughed with her children at the sight of me sleeping on the carpet, remembered Daniel's voice, telling her to use the memory card to trick me into surrender, remembered the casual cruelty of being excluded from my own table. The pity passed, replaced by a clarity sharper than any knife. "Family does not treat one another as burdens to be discarded," I said. "Family does not erase memories or box up their mother's chair or plan to strip rights from a man still living under his own roof. If that is what you call family, then I want no part of it." For a long moment there was only silence, broken by Clara's ragged sobs and the rustle of pigeons around my feet. Then Daniel, his voice low and venomous, said, "You'll regret this. When you're alone in some tiny room with no one to care for you, you'll regret what you've done." I met his gaze steadily, unafraid. "No," I answered. "I regretted my silence. I regretted my weakness. I regretted allowing you to strip me of dignity piece by piece. But this I will never regret. This is the first act in years that feels like justice." They left me there in the park, Clara clinging to Daniel's arm, both of them consumed by the reality that the home they had assumed would one day be theirs was gone. I watched them go without triumph, for what I felt was not gloating but release, as though the weight of years of humiliation had at last been lifted from me. I knew they would curse me, perhaps forever, and that neighbors might whisper that I was cruel or senile. But the truth was mine, and in the quiet of my heart I felt Margaret beside me, her hand on my shoulder, her voice whispering that dignity is worth more than love that comes with conditions. That night I slept better than I had in years. For once I did not dream of laughter mocking me from upstairs rooms or of voices telling me I was no longer needed. I dreamed of silence, of peace, of walking hand in hand with Margaret, through the garden as it once was, the roses blooming, the sun warm on our backs. And when I woke, I knew that whatever storms might come, I had already chosen the path of dignity over degradation, and that choice could not be undone. In the weeks that followed the storm of their outrage, the house that had once been mine and then theirs in spirit, though never in law, was emptied of us all, and I watched from a quiet distance as the new owners moved in with their fresh paint and eager plans, their laughter bright and unburdened by the history of betrayal that had saturated those walls. Clara and Daniel scrambled to find a rental, their voices sharp with panic as they made frantic phone calls in the driveway. And though part of me felt the temptation to soften, to extend some last act of mercy, I remained silent, because mercy had been mine to give for years, and they had squandered it with their cruelty. I packed my belongings slowly, carefully, choosing only those items that mattered, leaving behind the furniture they had once insisted on replacing, leaving behind the clutter of arguments and scorn, but carrying with me the things that were truly mine, the photograph of Margaret in her wedding dress, the watch she had given me on our 40th anniversary, the deed, now voided by my own hand, but still a symbol of my final act of defiance. When I moved into the small apartment near the park, I felt no shame, only relief. The rooms were modest, the ceilings lower, the kitchen smaller. But for the first time in years, every chair, every corner, every window belonged wholly to me. No one mocked me for forgetting a word, no one told me to eat elsewhere, no one suggested my presence was an inconvenience. I could make coffee at dawn and sit at the table in silence, reading the paper without interruption. And though the solitude was sharp at first, it soon became a balm, because it was chosen solitude, not the loneliness of being surrounded by people who had no respect for me. From my window I could see the park where pigeons gathered, and I often walked there with a bag of breadcrumbs, letting the rhythm of feeding them calm me. Sometimes I thought of Margaret and whispered to her that I had finally found peace, that the fight was over and the dignity we built together had been defended to the end. Clara tried once to visit, arriving at my door with tears in her eyes and anger in her voice, demanding an explanation she had already heard in the park, demanding that I undo what had been done. But there are no undoings in this world, only consequences, and I told her gently but firmly that I had nothing more to give. "You took me for granted," I said. "You erased your mother's memory, you laughed while I lay on the floor of my own house, and you plotted to strip from me the very thing I had worked my life to build. Now you must live with what you have earned." She wept, she accused, she begged, and then she left, and I did not call her back. Perhaps one day she will understand that what I did was not cruelty but balance, that I simply took away what she had already tried to steal. Perhaps she never will. That is no longer my burden. The grandchildren did not come. They had laughed at me too easily, had followed the cues of their parents without thought, and though I do not hate them, I cannot forget the sound of their voices mocking me as I lay on the floor. I do not know if time will soften that memory, but for now it is a scar too raw to touch, and Daniel, I suspect, will never forgive me, because men who measure their worth in property cannot abide the humiliation of losing it. Yet I feel no guilt. They thought they could strip me of everything, and instead I left them homeless, not because I wished them suffering, but because I refused to surrender my dignity in exchange for their comfort. Now, in the quiet of my apartment, I have found a new rhythm. I wake when I wish, I walk to the market, I sit in the park, and sometimes I even smile at the young families who pass by, their children running ahead, their parents calling after them. I wonder if those parents know how fragile the thread of family can be, how easily respect can be broken, how quickly love can turn into entitlement. I do not begrudge them their happiness, but I do not envy it either, because I have learned that peace is not found in being surrounded by others, but in refusing to let them trample what is sacred within you. I sold the roof over their heads, and in doing so I gave myself back the ground under my feet. The house is gone, my daughter is estranged, my grandchildren distant, but I am no longer the old man mocked in the corner of his own home. I am simply myself, a man who chose dignity over degradation, who chose silence over begging, who chose to end the story on his own terms. And though the world may never know the details, though my name will not be remembered beyond the small circle of those who cursed it, I will carry into the final years of my life the knowledge that I did not leave this earth bowed or erased. I left standing, unbroken, with the quiet satisfaction that justice, however small, had been served.